everyone, and welcome back to Kardec Radio for Teens. For those of you who don't know, Kardec Radio for Teens is a place where teens can talk to teens about Spiritism and learn through Spiritist teachings with other teens. Sometimes when we're just listening to adults lecture or we're reading a book, it's hard for us to understand and fully grasp the concepts that are being said, and sometimes we daze off and we can't really understand what they're saying as much as we're trying. So Kardec Radio for Teens is really important that teens can talk to teens and we can go through things slowly and figure it out and understand it in a way that us teens understand it. Because not everyone understands it the same way, but it's easier when we're closer in age. We can relate to more things. We can have more ways to communicate our topics, our ideas together. This week I wanted to try to start something a little different and see how it goes, and depending how it goes, we can keep trying to do this. So, as teens growing up in Spiritism, we've all heard about all these books that Allan Kardec wrote, and all these books and what they mean and what they say in them. But how many of us have actually picked one up and read one? Not a lot of us. We don't even have to pretend that we all have read them, because I bet none of us have read them. Only a select few. And a lot of us, we don't. We just hear our parents talking about it. We hear the adults talking about it. We know what the books are, but we have never picked it up and read it for ourselves. And one day, we're going to be the adults, and then what? We're never going to have read the books. So it's really important that we do go and sit down and read these books, but sometimes it's hard for us to focus and find the time to just sit down and read. So what I would like to try is to read it together and to go through it and understand it together, and we can break it up piece by piece so that we can actually understand what it's saying instead of just reading it and it going in one ear and out the other. Because all these books are the basis of Spiritism, and they're really important for us to study and learn now so that when we're older we can go back and study it again and learn more, even more. But it's important that we start having that basis of learning of these books. So my idea is for us to go through some of these books and to go through them together and learn about them and study them. And together we'll go learning and understanding these books that we've seen for our whole lives, but we've never really picked up ever. The book that I would like to start off with is The Spirits Book. I participated in a study of this book at my Santhru, and as much as I know a lot of you guys don't want to read these books, don't want to pick them up and read them, this one was really interesting and it's really insightful, and you actually learn a lot from it, and it's not boring at all. So I really think that this is a great one for us to start with. With that being said, let's get right to it. In a preface to the book I have, there's a biography, basically a short biography of Allan Kardec's life. And it's really interesting, but it's also really long. So I'm not going to read through all of it, but I think that it's really important. And if you guys want to go through it and read it on your own, that'd be really great. Or we can do our own separate Kardec Radio show where we just talk about Allan Kardec and his life and how that was. But for right now, I'd just like to go through a few key parts that I read and highlighted it throughout it that I think is important to know about him and the beginning of this book in general. So it starts off. Hippolyte Léon Denisard Revial, better known by his pen name, Allan Kardec, was born in Lyons on October 3, 1804, into an old family of Bourgeois Bresse. So that was really important that I highlighted right off the bat, because it's important to know that he didn't just have the name Allan Kardec. He had a real name, and Allan Kardec was just his pen name. And it's also important to know time and place. So the place was in Europe, and he was born October 3rd, 1804. So that helps us keep in mind what was going on at that time, and how old was he, what did they do at that time. And then reading on, it goes to show how ever since he was little, he was always curious and interested in investigating things, and to express freedom of thought, that what you believe in is what you believe in. You can believe whatever you want to. And he was also the member of several scholarly societies, so he was really focused on his education, and he was always looking for something to learn, looking to something to think, to investigate about. And then there's one part that says, around 1850, when the phenomenon of table turnings was grabbing the attention of Europe and ushering in other phenomenon, since known as spiritists, he quickly divined the real nature of those phenomena by being evidence for the existence of an order of relationships that has until then been suspected rather than known, those that unite the visible and invisible world. So this is important because that's showing us the time again in 1850, and it's showing us that, so he was around 45 then, and then with all that was going on about the phenomena and stuff, he took that opportunity to invest and to go figure out and to go search for what was happening. And then he went for it, and he dug deeper, and he started investigating and searching for answers to what was happening. And he was getting more and more information on all this. And there was this quote over here that he said to his wife one day. "It is a most curious thing. My conversations with the invisible intelligences have completely revolutionized my ideas and convicts. The instructions thus transmitted constitute an entirely new theory of human life, duty, and destiny, which appears to me to be perfectly rational and coherent, and admirably lucid and consoling, and intensely interesting. I have a great mind to publish these conversations in a book, for it seems to me that what interests me so deeply might very likely prove interest to others as well." So he said that to his wife, and that's really interesting because that's how we get about the book being made. Why was the book made in the first place? So he was having these conversations with the spirits, with the, what did he call it? With the invisible intelligences, as he called them. And he was having these conversations, and he was becoming so enlightened, and he liked what they were saying, and he agreed with what they were saying. So he said, "Oh, I should publish these into a book so that other people might be as interested as I am too, and they might like it too." So that's exactly what he did. He wrote questions, and he asked the spirits these questions, and the spirits would answer, and he would just write down what they answered through mediumship. And he got all these questions, and he put them together and put them into a book so that everyone could know about it. And he also didn't want it to be published under his own name, so that's where he put in the pen name Allan Kardec, and that's when that became his name, per se. So the book was quickly produced and published and sold really quick, and not only in France, but all over the continent of Europe. And Allan Kardec was making a household name. Everyone was reading that book. Everyone was interested in what he had to say and what his book was about. And that is where this book came to be, which is really important to know the fundamentals and where this book came from before we just go and dive into reading it. That's as far as we're going to go with that preface, with that biography of him, but it is really interesting, and there's a lot more information on him if you're interested in that. And now onto the introduction. I was going to paraphrase like I did with the preface and just go over quick things, but they said it so perfectly and so well understood that I'd like to just read this first paragraph, and then we'll talk about it, and then we can move on. So it goes. "When new matters arise, new words are needed for such sake of clarity of language, in order to avoid the confusion inherited in multiple meanings of the same terms. For example, the words spiritual, spiritualist, and spiritualism each have a well-defined meaning. To give each of them a new meaning in order to apply it to the Spirit's doctrine would be to multiply the already numerous cause of ambiguity. Strictly speaking, spiritualism is the opposite of materialism, and everyone who believes there is something within them that is more than matter are spiritualists. However, it does not necessarily follow that they must therefore believe in the existence of spirits or in communications with the invisible world. Therefore, instead of the words spiritual and spiritualism for designating this later belief, we have coined and employed the words spiritist and spiritism. These two terms reflect their origin and their fundamental meanings, and they thus have the advantage of being perfectly understandable. We will leave spiritualism to its own meaning. Hence, we will say that the principle of the Spirit's doctrine, or Spiritism, is based on the relationship between the material world and the invisible world, the latter being inhabited by beings known as spirits. The adherents of Spiritism will be called Spiritists. In a specialized sense, the Spirit's book contains the Spiritist doctrine. In a generalized sense, it is linked to spiritualism and represents one aspect of it. That is why we have inscribed the words on the title of the page, Spiritualist Philosophy. So that was pretty long, but I think that that's really insightful to see, that there's a difference between spiritualism, spiritualist, and spiritist. There is a difference, and that's really important, and they establish that. That's the first thing he establishes, right in the first page, the first introduction. Because words such like spiritual and spiritualist and spiritualism, they mean that everyone who believes that there's something more than just material, they're spiritualists. But it's not saying that they have to believe in spirits and the existence and communication with the invisible world. And that's a very clear distinction, so they made a new word. They made spiritism so that they could define if we're talking about just the opposite of materialism or if we're talking about something more than that. So instead of just making it one word and making it a little confusing, they just made a whole new word so that there could be a clear distinction about what you believe in and have a clear name for it. So there's a clear distinction between spiritualism and spiritism, and what this book is, it's spiritism, not spiritualism. And that's really important that they put that right in the beginning so that there's no confusions. Now on to part 2. There is another word that we must also agree on, since it is one of the key words to every moral doctrine, and to that end it has provoked innumerable controversies due to the lack of general accepting meaning. It is the word soul. The differences of viewpoints regarding the nature of the soul comes from individual definitions that each person attaches to this world. A perfect language, in which each idea would be represented by its own specialized term, would avoid many arguments. With a single word for each thing, everything would be understood. According to some, the soul is the principle of material, organic life. It has no existence of its own, and at death it ceases to exist. This view is purely materialistic. In this sense, and by comparison, those who have adopted this view speak of the body at death as though it were a broken instrument that no longer produced any sound, that it no longer has a soul. According to this viewpoint, the soul would be an effect rather than a cause. Others believe that the soul is the principle of intelligence, the universal agent of which is being absorbed a portion. According to this group, there is only one soul in the entire universe. This soul distributes a spark of itself to the various intelligent beings throughout their lives. At death, each spark returns to the common source, where it merges once again into the whole, just as streams and rivers return to the ocean and gave them origin. This viewpoint differs from the preceding one, in that according to this theory, there is something more than the matter within us, something that remains after death. On the other hand, it is almost as if nothing actually remained. Since our individual personalities no longer survives, we are no longer conscious of ourselves. According to this viewpoint, the universal soul would be God, and each being would be a portion of God. This is a type of pantheism. So let's break that up a little. So they're saying that another word that we have to go through and to define is the word soul, because it's one word and we think it's a common word that everyone hears all the time. But when you actually have to define it, it's kind of difficult to have a definition. So the word soul, that's what we need a definition for. And he said how some people, they think that after death, the soul just dies, it's just gone, and that's it. And that's a materialistic point of view. Other people, they think that there's only one soul in the whole universe, and that for every person, a little piece of that soul is in that person and in every person. But then once that person dies, the little piece of soul goes back to the whole thing. And the big soul, the only soul in the universe, would be God. So they would say that everyone's a little portion of God. So that is pantheism, as they call it. So that's already two different definitions of the word soul, which is seeing why we need clarification of the word, because there's already so many different ways to view the same thing. And then they continue with another definition of the word soul. Finally, according to others, the soul is a moral being distinct from and independent of matter, and it preserves its individuality after death. This concept is inconsistible, the most common, because under one name or another, the idea of this being that survives the body is an instinctive belief that is independent of any particular teaching and can be found among all cultures to whatever degree they might have become. This doctrine in which the soul is a cause and not an effect is that of spiritualists. So this other viewpoint they're saying is the most common viewpoint, and that even though other different cultures give it different names, this is relatively the same concept that most cultures believe in, and it's that the soul continues even after the death of the material body. The soul will continue on. It doesn't just die out. So then this is the part where the soul is a cause, not an effect. So they gave us 3 different definitions of the word soul, and now we're going to go through them and figure out what we're really talking about here. Because remember, back in the beginning, what they were saying is they want to clearly define the word soul so that we understand, and so we're all on the same page while we go through this book. So then it continues. Without discussion of merit of each of these viewpoints, and considering only the linguistic side of the issue, we will state that these 3 applications of the word soul comprise 3 distinct ideas. Each one requires a different term. Thus, the word soul can have one of 3 meanings, and each is correct from its own viewpoint of views according to its own particular definition. Language itself is to blame for having only one word available for 3 different ideas. In order to avoid confusion, it would be necessary to limit the meaning of the word soul to one of those 3 ideas. Choosing this and that definition would not matter, since it is simply a matter of convention. The more important thing is clarity. We think that is most logical to take us in the commonest meaning. We thus use soul to indicate the immaterial and individual being that dwells within and survives the body. Even if this being did not really exist and was not more than a product of the imagination, the term would be needed to designate it nonetheless. So here they're continuing and they're saying how language itself is really to blame, because there should be different words for these different ideas, because they're 3 completely different ideas, so we need to distinguish them. And to say, taking the commonest meaning of the word, they said that the soul is to indicate the material and individual being that dwells within the survival and survives the body. Lacking such a specific term for each of the other 2 ideas, we will apply the label vital principle to define the material and organic life principle, whatever its source may be, which is common to all living creatures, from plants to animals. Since life can exist without the faculty of thought, the vital principle is something distinct and independent of it. The word vitality would not express the same idea, however. For some, the vital principle is a property of matter, an effect produced wherever matter is found under given conditions. According to others, and this idea is the commonest, it is found in a special universally diffused fluid, each being absorbed and assimilated a portion of this fluid throughout its life, much as in its body absorbed light. This substance is the vital fluid, which, according to certain opinions, would be the same thing as the animalistic electric energy, also designated the magnetic fluid, neutral fluid, etc. So here they're bringing a new term into these definitions that we need, and it's the vital principle. And with the vital principle, they're saying, comes the vital fluid, which is basically what makes up everything, a special universally diffused fluid. Later on in the book, they go on to explain more about this fluid and about what it is, but basically they're saying that this is what everything is made out of. If you break anything down to the smallest form it can possibly get, it would be this special universally diffused fluid, which they call the vital fluid. So that's a little confusing for a lot of people to understand, but hopefully throughout this book we'll be able to understand more of it. Whatever the case may be, there is one incontestable fact for results from observation, and that is that organic beings possess an inner force that produces the phenomenon of life, as long as this force exists. That physical life is common to all organic beings and is independent of intelligence and thought. That intelligence and thought are faculties peculiar to certain organic species. And lastly, that among the organic species endowed with intelligence and thought, there is one that is endowed with a special moral sense that gives it incontestable ascendancy over the other, the human species. And now we're going to go back to talking about the definition of the word soul, so we can go on to continue understanding the rest of the book. It should be understood that in its multiple meanings, the term soul does not exclude either materialism or pantheism. Spiritualists themselves can very well understand soul according to one or the other of the first two definitions, without denying the distinct immaterial being. They would give some other name to it. Thus, the word soul does not represent a personal opinion. It is a protestant, which they have a footnote, is a Greek sea god capable of assuming different forms. So they're saying that right there, just to clarify that, they're saying that it's the word soul, it's like this thing that it can take different forms and it can be seen in different ways. That everyone may adapt in their own way, a fact that has led to endless argument. So they're saying how soul really is kind of vague because there's a lot of different meanings that you can take from it, and it provides a lot of arguments because everyone sees it as something different and people believe different things. So although the word soul, it's like it has different forms, you can see it in so many ways, but many people disagree on what the actual meaning should be. Even if we were to use the word soul in all three of its meanings, we might avoid confusion if we added a qualification to it in order to specify the way in which we investigate it or the application we are given it at the time. Hence, it would be a generic term representing simultaneously the principle of material life, intelligence, and moral sense. Each of these would be distinguished by a particular attribution, like gas, for example, which may be differentiated by using the word hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. Perhaps we can more correctly use the term vital soul for the principle of material life, intellectual soul for the principle of intelligence, and spiritual soul for the principle of our individuality after death. As one can plainly see, it is all but a matter of words, but it is very important matter for us to understand nevertheless. Thus, the vital soul would be common to all organ beings, plants, animals, and humans. The intellectual soul would be a distinctive property of animals and humans, and the spiritual soul would be only applied to humans. We believe it is necessary to insist on such explanations, since the Spiritist doctrine naturally rests on the existence within us of a being independent of matter. This being survives the body at death. Since the word soul is repeatedly frequently throughout this work, we have thus had to set the meaning we attach to it in order to avoid any misunderstanding. We now come to the principal objective of this preliminary instruction. So there, it was finally defined. They were saying that it can be defined as a lot of different ways, but if we take it into these three terms, the vital soul, the intellectual soul, and the spiritual soul, then we'll all be on the same page on what we're talking about. So the vital soul is in all organic beings, plants, animals, humans, all of that stuff. The intellectual soul only is in animals and humans, and then the spiritual soul will only apply to humans. So that's really the main thing that we have to remember and to understand. So we're not just talking about the soul because there's so many different definitions of that. But if we break it up into the vital soul, the intellectual soul, and the spiritual soul, then it'll be easier to understand. So again, the vital soul is everything. It can be the animals, the plants, and humans. The intellectual soul would be only animals and humans, and the spiritual soul is only the humans. And then they say that we believe it's necessary to have these explanations because although it may just seem like the boring beginning of a book that no one really wants to read, you just want to skip and move on, it's really important because it's setting the basis. If you didn't read this introduction, you wouldn't understand what they were talking about on question 100. You wouldn't understand what they're trying to explain when they say all these different terms. So it's really important to define them in the beginning and get that out of the way so that we can understand the rest of the book and what they're saying. Not even going into the actual book, but just the introduction, they set the basis for so much that is Spiritism that you need to know. You need to have the basis before you can go on and learn. So the introduction, I think, as much as it's that part that everyone's like, oh, let's just skip the introduction and go straight to where the book starts, it's the really important part that we need because if we don't understand the basics, how are we going to understand the more complicated stuff? So I think this is really good how we started, and I really like it, and we'll see how it goes for next time if we want to continue doing that or go back to something else. One thing that I would like to end off with, though, is a quote from the Daily Book of Positive Quotations. In this book, it's actually numbered by day, like every day of the year. They have its own specific message. So if we do this reading the book and going through it like we did, then I'll just get the message of the day and read it so that we have something to reflect on of our week, as well as what we just read and understood. September 6th. Bad memory. Happiness is good health and a bad memory. We worry a lot about forgetting things. We make notes and tuck them in our pockets or post lists in prominent places around the house. We keep our address book, our daily calendar with us at all times. We practice little tricks for remembering names and places. We would be happier, though, if we could forget some things. Let's forget about those occasions when people betrayed us and made us cry or sinned against us. Let's forget about those times where we embarrassed ourselves, acted meanly, or let ourselves down. There is no point in wallowing in such memories, and plenty of reasons to move on. My good memories I'll keep for a long time. My bad ones I'll let go. So that's just a message for us to end it off with and to just think about throughout your week. If you're obsessing over a little bad memory, a little time you were embarrassed in the past, then move on and keep going on and just remember the good memories and keep moving on and learn from those mistakes, but then look at them, learn from them, and then we can move on.
This has been Kardec Radio for Teens. Thank you all for listening.